In the fall of 1975, a brand new Ford rolled off the lot with a V8 under the hood that almost nobody was excited about. It was big. It was heavy. It was supposed to be powerful. And yet, car magazines barely mentioned it. Buyers avoided it. Even Ford fans shrugged. That engine was the 351 MEM. And here's the part most people don't realize. This wasn't some cheap throwaway motor. It was born from racing bloodlines. It shared DNA with one of Ford's toughest big blocks. On paper, it should have been a beast. It had the bones of something special, the kind of foundation that engine builders dream about. So how did a V8 with muscle car roots end up as one of the most unwanted engines Ford ever built? That's the real story, and it starts with very bad timing. By the early 1970s, Detroit was under siege. Muscle cars had ruled the streets just a few years earlier. The late 1960s were the peak. Chevelle with 454s, Mustangs with Boss engines, Roadrunners with Hemis. Every manufacturer was in an arms race to build the most powerful, most aggressive machines possible. Horsepower numbers were advertised like trophies. Quarter-mile times were bragging rights. But now everything was changing. The Clean Air Act was tightening emissions rules. The government wanted cleaner air, and internal combustion engines were the target. Suddenly, engineers who had spent their careers chasing horsepower were being told to chase emissions compliance instead. Insurance companies were killing performance cars with insane premiums. If you were young and wanted a muscle car, you might pay more for insurance than for the car payment itself. And the oil crisis had turned gas stations into lines of angry drivers waiting for fuel that might not even be there. The 1973 oil embargo changed everything almost overnight. Horsepower was suddenly a liability. Ford was stuck in the middle of it all. They had built their reputation on performance, the GT40, the Boss Mustangs, the Cobras. But now the rules were different. The market was different. The whole world was different. The legendary 351 Cleveland, with its massive ports and high-revving nature, was on borrowed time. That engine was built for an era that was ending. Its big flowing heads were terrible for emissions. Its appetite for fuel was politically unacceptable. The 351 Windsor was still around, and it was a solid engine, but it didn't fit Ford's future plans for larger, heavier cars and trucks. And the big 400 cubic inch engines? Too expensive, too thirsty, too politically incorrect for the new reality. Ford needed something new, or at least something repurposed. Something that could fit in the big cars and trucks, something that could pass emissions tests, something that could be built on existing tooling without massive new investment. So engineers reached into the parts bin and made a decision that would haunt the 351 forever. They took the 400 cubic inch block, part of Ford's 335 series engine family, and de-stroked it. The 400 had been a decent engine in its own right. Plenty of torque, good durability, designed for heavy vehicles and trucks. The result of this de-stroking was 351 cubic inches, achieved with a 4.00-inch bore and a 3.50-inch stroke. That's right. This small 351 was actually built on a big block-sized architecture. It wasn't really a small block at all. It just happened to have small block displacement. It had huge main bearings, thick cylinder walls that could handle significant abuse, a deck height of around 10.3 inches, much taller than a Windsor. This thing was physically massive. In fact, it was wider and heavier than many 390 FE engines from a decade earlier. Those FE engines had powered everything from Galaxies to GT40s. They were considered big blocks by any standard. And the 351M was built on an even larger platform. On the engine stand, it looked tough, overbuilt, almost indestructible. Mechanics who saw one for the first time were impressed by the sheer mass of it. The block casting was thick and heavy. The rotating assembly looked like it could handle anything. This looked like an engine built for serious work. But then you looked at the numbers. Compression ratio, a painfully low 8.01 in most configurations. Some versions dipped even lower. That's the kind of compression ratio you'd expect on a farm tractor, not a V8 from the company that built the Boss 302. Horsepower? Around 148 to 161 net horsepower depending on year and tune. That's not a typo. A 351 cubic inch V8 making less than 165 horsepower. Torque hovered in the 270 to 280 lb-ft range, which sounds decent until you realize it arrived early and fell flat fast. There was no top-end rush, no feeling of the engine coming alive at higher RPM. It just sort of gave up once you got past 3,500 RPM. This was the mid-1970s. Everything was slow. Chevy's 350 wasn't great either, but at least it felt responsive. At least it had some character when you pushed it. The 351M felt tired, even when it was brand new, even when it had 0 miles on the odometer. It felt like an engine that had already given up. And that's where the trouble started. Most people assume the 351M was a bad design, that Ford's engineers made mistakes, that the engine was fundamentally flawed from the beginning. But that's not really true. Not even close. The block itself was strong, extremely strong. It used a large main journal diameter of 320 inches, the same as the 400. That's bigger than many engines with significantly more displacement. The crankshaft was stout and heavily counterweighted. The connecting rods were beefy. In race trim, with the right parts, this bottom end could take serious abuse. It could handle power levels that would destroy lesser engines. The problem wasn't strength, it was strangulation. To meet the new emissions rules, Ford paired the 351M with tiny cam profiles that barely opened the valves. The camshaft was designed for idle quality and emissions, not power. It had almost no duration and minimal lift. The engine could barely breathe at anything above idle. Then came the restrictive exhaust manifolds. Heavy cast iron manifolds with crimped passages that choked exhaust flow. The engine was trying to push spent gases through openings that were barely adequate for an engine half its size. And the intake designs prioritized clean burn over airflow. Every passage was designed to slow the air down, to keep fuel atomized, to make emissions testing easier. Performance was an afterthought. Add in retarded ignition timing that prevented detonation but killed power. Add in lean fuel mixtures that met EPA standards but left the engine feeling gutless. And the engine never had a chance to breathe. It was being suffocated from every angle. One Ford engineer reportedly joked that the 351M could survive a nuclear blast, but not a freeway on-ramp. He wasn't wrong, and drivers noticed immediately. In a 1977 Ford LTD or Torino, the engine felt lazy, disconnected. You pressed the gas, waited, and eventually the car moved. There was a delay that felt almost broken, like something wasn't working right, but that was just how the engine ran. That hesitation was normal. Quarter-mile times were often in the high 17-second range. Some dipped into the 18s. For a V8-powered car, that was embarrassing. Some four-cylinder imports from Japan were running similar times with half the displacement and a fraction of the weight. Top speed wasn't impressive either, with many cars struggling to crack 110mm rates. Not that anyone was testing top speed in cars with these engines. Nobody cared enough to try. Fuel economy was the real insult. Despite all the emissions equipment and the strangled tune, the 351M got maybe 12 to 14 miles per gallon on a good day. Highway driving might push it to 16 if you were lucky and had a tailwind. That was barely better than the 400 it was based on. All that lost performance for almost no gain in efficiency. For an engine carrying the 351 badge, that was humiliating. But the real insult came from enthusiasts. See, muscle car fans already knew what 351 was supposed to mean. The 351 Cleveland, especially in 4V form, made over 300 gross horsepower with ease. Some factory versions were underrated at 330 horsepower and probably made more. Huge valves that flowed massive amounts of air, free-flowing heads that were some of the best Ford ever designed, high RPM capability that let it scream all the way to redline. The Cleveland was raw and aggressive. It sounded mean. It felt alive. It rewarded drivers who pushed it hard. The 351 WEM shared none of that personality. Different block, different heads with smaller ports and smaller valves, different bell housing pattern that required different transmissions, different everything. And that bell housing detail mattered more than most people realized. The 351 MEM used the big block transmission pattern. That meant heavier gearboxes designed for truck duty, more rotating mass in the drivetrain, slower response when you pressed the throttle. It was fine for trucks and full-size sedans that were never going to be sporty anyway. But it was terrible for performance credibility. You couldn't just swap in a small block transmission from a Mustang. You couldn't use the same bell housing as a Windsor. Everything had to match the big block pattern, and that meant everything was heavier and slower. Worse, Ford quietly dropped the Cleveland around the same time. The legendary 351C disappeared from the option sheets without fanfare. So in the public's mind, the 351M wasn't just underwhelming, it was the replacement for something legendary. And that's a death sentence for any engine's reputation. How do you follow up one of the most respected performance engines of the muscle car era with something that can barely get out of its own way? You don't. You can't. The comparison was inevitable and brutal. By the late 1970s, the engine had a reputation, and not a good one. Car magazines called it uninspired and adequate at best. They didn't waste much ink on it because there wasn't much to say. Owners complained about fuel economy that was barely better than a 400. What was the point of the smaller engine if it didn't save any gas? Mechanics didn't love working on it either. Parts compatibility was confusing. It looked like a small block, but behaved like a big block. Parts stores didn't always know which parts to pull. Some Windsor parts would fit, some wouldn't. Some 400 parts would work, others wouldn't. Every repair was a guessing game. The engine existed in this weird in-between space where nothing was quite right. Too big for small block applications, too small for big block credibility, too slow for performance, too thirsty for economy. And yet, there was something hiding under the surface, because when racers and hot rodders finally started tearing into the 351M, they noticed something interesting. The block didn't flinch. You could bore it over. You could stroke it. You could throw nitrous at it. You could boost it. And the bottom end just kept working. The main caps held. The cylinder walls survived. The crank kept turning. With aftermarket pistons, compression could be bumped to 9.5.1 or even 10.1 safely. Suddenly, the engine was running compression ratios that made sense for a performance application. Swap in a real camshaft with actual duration and lift. Open up the intake with a proper manifold designed for airflow. Ditch the smog-era exhaust manifolds for headers that actually let the engine breathe. Suddenly, the engine woke up. It was like the 351M had been sleeping the whole time, like it had been held back by all that emissions equipment. Once you set it free, it came alive. Built properly with a good cam and intake, a 351M could make 350 horsepower without stressing the bottom end. That was more than double what the factory version made. And it was reliable power. Power the engine could make all day long without complaint. Push it harder with forged pistons and upgraded connecting rods and better heads, and 400 plus horsepower was achievable. Some builders pushed past 450. A few crazy builds went even higher. Torque was the real weapon. Long intake runners and big displacement architecture meant brutal low-end pull. The kind of torque that pinned you to the seat at 2,000 RPM. The kind of torque that could spin tires without even trying. In trucks, that mattered. Ford quietly leaned into this. The 351M found a second life in F-Series pickups, Broncos, and work vehicles. It wasn't fast. Nobody was winning races with these trucks. But it could haul, it could tow, and it would do it forever. The same characteristics that made it lazy in a passenger car made it perfect for work duty. All that torque down low meant you didn't have to rev it to move heavy loads. All that overbuilt strength meant it could work hard every day without wearing out. Some fleet trucks racked up 200,000 miles with nothing more than oil changes and timing chain replacements. The timing chain was the weak point. Ford used cheap chains that stretched over time, but replaced the chain every 100,000 miles, keep oil in it, and the engine would outlast the truck around it. The same overbuilt design that made it slow also made it durable. Still, that didn't save its image. In the minds of car enthusiasts, the 350 was still a joke. The engine that replaced the Cleveland. The engine that couldn't get out of its own way. The engine that represented everything wrong with 1970s American automobiles. By 1982, Ford pulled the plug. The 351M and its big brother, the 400, were gone. Canceled. Replaced by more efficient engines that fit the new world better. The 302 got fuel injection. New modular engines were on the drawing board. Lightweight designs were the future. The 351M didn't fit anymore. Tooling was scrapped. Production ended quietly. No farewell tour, no final special edition, no celebration of the engine's contributions. It just disappeared from the option sheets one day and nobody really noticed. And almost immediately, the engine slipped into obscurity. Today, mention a 351 Windsor and people nod in approval. That's a respected engine with a strong following. Say, 351 Cleveland and eyes light up. That's a legend. A muscle car icon. An engine that enthusiasts still dream about. But 351 NIM? Most people don't even know what the M stands for. It was never officially defined by Ford. Some say modified because it was modified from the 400. Others say Michigan because of where it was built. Some say it meant nothing at all, just a letter to differentiate it from the other 351s. Ford never clarified, which somehow feels appropriate, because the 351M lives in that strange space between eras. Too late to be a muscle car legend. Too early to be a modern engine. Built for a world that didn't want what it offered. Created to solve problems that nobody liked thinking about. And yet, there's a quiet respect growing around it now. Builders who understand its strengths are revisiting it. They're looking past the reputation and seeing the potential. The thick block is perfect for boosted applications. Those heavy cylinder walls can handle boost pressures that would crack a thinner casting. Turbocharged 351 MEMS have shown shocking durability. You can run 15, 20, even 25 pounds of boost on a properly built example. With modern heads and fuel injection, the old weaknesses disappear. You're not stuck with restrictive factory heads anymore. You're not choking the engine with emissions equipment. You can build it the way it should have been built from the factory. Suddenly, the engine makes sense. But in its own time, it never stood a chance. The 350mm wasn't a failure because it was weak. It wasn't a failure because Ford's engineers made mistakes. The engineering was sound, the architecture was robust, the potential was real. It failed because it arrived when power was illegal, speed was suspect, and enthusiasm was being regulated out of existence. It failed because it replaced a legend. It failed because its strengths couldn't be expressed in the world it was born into. It was a muscle engine born into an era that hated muscle. And that's why nobody wanted it. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Ford's most misunderstood engines, let me know in the comments what forgotten motor you want next. And make sure to subscribe, because there are a lot more buried stories under old hoods just waiting to be told.